let's start going through some ideas of how you can really make your meetings more effective. I'm going to share my screen now, and I'm going to go to the good old PowerPoint. What we're going to do is, here we go, there we are. So we do spend a lot of our time in meetings, although 50% of you don't feel that you do. Research by HBR actually showed that we spend almost 50% of our working week for senior managers. That's a lot of time, isn't it, spent in meetings. It does very often feel a lot longer than that. Sometimes you can feel you're in a permanent meeting. So the more we can do to make those meetings successful, the better. So this is the whole idea of this webinar. So how can we use Belbin to make meetings better? Well, there's lots of things that we need to look at when you're setting up a meeting. You know, what's the reason for the meeting? Who should be involved? How long should the meeting be? What are the desired outcomes? All of these really need to be asked perhaps before the meeting even starts to be able to make those meetings more effective. And we'll be looking now at each of those in turn. I will just say here is that I say this on so many different webinars, so many different training sessions and workshops. The more time you can spend preparing for something, the better. The more time you can really analyse what it is you're after, the objectives, so on and so forth, the more effective meetings become and parts of projects become, so on and so forth. Wouldn't you agree, Vicky?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think it's, as we were saying earlier, with the danger with meetings can be, if it's a regular thing in the diary, it kind of creeps up on you, doesn't it? And you don't necessarily have that time to step back and think about what you want to get from it.
Absolutely, that's really, really true, isn't it? Those regular meetings that are in there, and you're not entirely sure why. So spend time up front. Spend time working out what is the reason. Why are you there? And it's important, doesn't it? Because it informs the rest of it. Spend time, and we have some, I was looking at these earlier, some conversation cards actually. I don't know if anybody else has seen them. Nobody will be able to see it now because obviously I'm off camera a bit. But ask people, do they know what it is that's being achieved? Do they know objectives of the team, what they're there to do? Ask those questions up front. Also, be really conscious of what your team roles are here. We were talking about this, weren't we, Vicky? Is that I have a tendency, as one of my top team roles as shaper, is that when I feel that we need a meeting, I want it now. I want everybody to drop everything. I expect to be heard, so on and so forth. And I have to be really conscious of that. I have to be conscious of my own team roles when I'm thinking about what is the reason for the meeting. Otherwise, it's really not as effective as it could be. Make sure that any communication is really clear. We had an instance today, we've got a meeting in 2 weeks' time. I assumed that somebody else had sent out the agenda, somebody assumed that somebody else had. And suddenly it was, well, we know we're meeting, but we're not sure why or anything. Have clarity, make sure people understand exactly why. And also, you know, think about things like timings, etc. That's all important as well. But the meeting is designed to support, you know, the objective. And that leads on to, of course, who should be involved. Because you don't necessarily need everybody involved all of the time. This is where we have problems, don't we? When we all turn up for the same meetings and they tend to go on, nothing really gets agreed. There's not that great communication between. It's really important to work out after what's the objective, what's the purpose of the meeting, is who should be involved. And of course, different team roles are needed at different times. So when you're looking at the beginning, perhaps if you're of a project, and this is a brainstorming meeting, it's a meeting where you're looking for ideas, which team roles do you need? Vicky, are you invited to many of those meetings?
The brainstorming one. No, I think the door's locked and I'm on the outside.
But why is that?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? I was just thinking, relating that back to what you were saying, I think sometimes we start with agenda and then we think about people and we think, okay, maybe we need to represent different departments, or we need to sort of be political and make sure that people aren't left out. As you say, some people will will get that FOMO, won't they? Well, maybe I should just be involved, because then I'll be in on the ground floor and I'll understand what's going on. Whereas actually, it just might not be the right stage. Because for those sort of less familiar with team roles, you need your that sort of creativity, you need the plant and resource investigator at the beginning to kind of generate those ideas and have the freedom to do that without necessarily having to do the evaluation, turn it into a plan, consider all the finer details, because something that is actually quite a good idea, but it's just hatched, it's not kind of ready for that level of scrutiny, is then sort of cast aside. Whereas actually, you know, it could have had legs, it just maybe got shot down a little bit too early. Sorry, lots of mixed metaphors there, but you get you get the idea. So yeah, I think really sort of paying attention to who do we need, how can we best represent the team roles that we need for that stage.
And I think it's quite important here, we're not talking about people yet, we're talking about behaviours, aren't we? So we're looking at what is the team there to achieve, what behaviours do we need to allow that to happen. And like you said, this is a great excuse for not inviting people who perhaps you always feel that you should, because it's saying we're looking for these particular behavioural contributions. So I know your job title indicates this, or you've got a bit of FOMO, or perhaps you want that department to always be represented at a meeting, but be aware that the behaviours that we're after right now are, in this example, those of plants resource investigators, the brand new ideas, or, you know, ideas taken from outside of the organisation. And conversely, when you get towards the end of a project and perhaps your meeting is looking more about the implementation, the planning, the checking that you have everything exactly as it should be, you're towards that sort of end stage. Make sure that, you know, people like myself are out of it, because then that's where you start getting that really annoying behavioural contribution that says, well, actually, I've had another idea, we could do it like this. Which again can make meetings become very inefficient and people get quite cross because it's not an appropriate contribution at that time. And
actually, I think it's not just sort of, it's not about keeping people out, it's that it's quite uncomfortable, I think, if you're an implementer and you are in that ideas fair, to hear all of these, why don't we change the way we do this? You know, why don't we do things completely differently? It's not a comfortable place necessarily for an implementer to be. And similarly with plants and resource investigators, when you are sort of working in a very methodical way through a plan, it's just not going to be interesting to them, is it? So whilst I think there's a balance there with awareness of what's going on in the business and that project, I think it's just sort of being mindful of what you need, as you say, at each point.
Absolutely. So you've got the objective, and then you know what behaviours you need. So that's the second step, isn't it? But it's not just a case of what behaviours you need. One of the other aspects that's really important is also the size of the meeting, how many people you need to be involved, because too many and people are no longer engaged. People no longer know what the contribution that they're meant to be making. Things start getting duplicated. Too few, and there's problems as well. It's less about team dynamics in that case, isn't it?
Definitely, yeah. And looking back at Meredith's original research that he did at Henley, he started off with these big syndicates, didn't he, of sort of 10 or 11, in an effort to try and get that diversity. But what he found was that it was catastrophic for decision making, because, you know, in a meeting situation, you'd be going around, every single person will be having their say. I'm sure we've all been in meetings where, you know, things are getting repeated, or you know, it gets counterproductive. It's not the best way to get from one point to another. So what he did in the research was to begin sort of cutting that down, didn't he, bit by bit. So with the EME, the executive management exercise, which was this sort of high intensity game that they were playing to bring these behaviours out, they started cutting that down to 8, didn't they, to start with. But they still found that they had people who were on the periphery, who weren't really contributing, who weren't engaged. And then they took it down to 6. And by that point, you're getting more stability in the team. You've often got somebody who's chairing if it's a meeting, and that kind of lends structure to the team. But then when you get down to 4, what you start to find is you get more of these opportunities to rotate leadership, don't you? So you're looking more at who is the best person to lead the meeting at this stage. And I don't know if we haven't sort of spoken about this in relation to meetings, but also with decision making, where you've got an even number, you're not sort of relying on a casting vote. So you are making sure that you've got that rigor in the decision making process, and it isn't just, okay, that's it, decision taken, let's go.
I'm laughing at this point, Vicky, because there is an ongoing argument between Meredith Belbin and his son Nigel Belbin about whether or not it should be 4 or 5. And it's
Yes.
really interesting is Nigel's more business focused and feels the need to move on. Because you can't debate everything forever and a day. And so he likes the idea of there being that odd number so that there is somebody who can make the decision at last, so everything can move forward. Whereas Meredith is more about, well, we can keep talking about it, we need to get far more consensus, which again is yes, that should be the way to do it, but sometimes business and timings, etc., don't allow that to happen.
Definitely. And we were talking earlier, I think, about the Ringelmann effect, weren't we? Which is what they discovered was that as group size increases, you get people kind of coasting along, social loafing, as they call it. And you can see that in meetings as well, people sort of becoming disengaged. If they're on Zoom, they might be sort of typing away, doing something else. And I think where you are using individual strengths and you've identified you want that person in the meeting because they've got something to contribute, where they identified those individual strengths, they found, I think it was in Forsyth's research, that you give that person a connection, even in a bigger setting, a bigger meeting. You can give that person a connection to the overall purpose of the team, of the meeting, and that helps fuel engagement. That helps prevent these sort of effects that you get with the larger numbers. So I think even in a meeting where you do have more people, still knowing those team roles that are present is so valuable.
It's interesting, isn't it? Size is so important, and yet we sometimes just don't think about it. It's not on the checklist of what to do to put together an effective meeting. It's not thought about. Size is seen as irrelevant, but actually it really is crucial. And again, when you get to less than 4, because of course the contribution every individual is making when it's 4 is quite significant. So you take out perhaps number 4 and you have 3, it's far more noticeable, and it's far more difficult sometimes to keep the dynamic going, would you say?
Yeah, and I think if we're thinking about a project team, for example, that's meeting over time, and we're saying that we want to include people with the right team roles, that project team is going to be changing. And when you take away a person from a smaller team, you are taking away a far bigger element of that team. And the interplay of personalities becomes far more intense and more complicated. That's what Meredith discovered in his research, that it's actually, you destabilize the team if it's too small, because the team stops being an entity with a specific purpose, and it becomes about those few personalities that are present. Perfect.
So we've looked at make sure that people know the purpose of the meeting. Well, what is that meeting there to do? You know, are you at what stage are you at? And then also looking at team size. The other element to look at is also time. How long should that meeting be on for? And it's interesting, this has come up in the chat actually, Adrian, you're quite right. Too much time, it does imply that you feel that time's being wasted, isn't it? So we really do need to look at how we fill that time and the structure of the meeting. How much time does it need? Now, I'm a great believer actually that if you have a really structured meeting, everybody knows what they're there to contribute, everything is very clear, you can have a half-day meeting and it doesn't feel that any of that time is being wasted, because your contribution and what you're there to achieve is really, really clear in the outset. And I tend to think that's with smaller teams as well. So if you have a meeting with just sort of 4, 5, 6 people, you can probably sustain it for a little bit longer. Other practical elements, though, come in as well, don't they? As our meetings, a lot of them are online right now, one element, somebody told me, and I think it's a great top tip, is to never start or finish a meeting actually at the hour. at the o'clock. Make sure it starts or finishes 10 minutes after or 10 minutes to allow people to go to other meetings. Otherwise, we find ourselves, in back-to-back meetings, and nobody is ever going to be at their best in that situation. Other top tips, I don't know, we were talking about this before, weren't we, Vicky? It really does make a difference whether or not you're a hybrid team or not, doesn't it?
Definitely, yeah. And I think we're more aware, aren't we, than we perhaps were 2 years ago about how we set up meetings when people are working virtually, and how it sort of affects those dynamics when people are in different places and when we're looking at a screen rather than in a room. That certainly does change things. And I think another thing that's sort of important to point out is that your team role preferences, your top team roles, might influence how comfortable you are in meetings. For example, high team workers might not feel that comfortable in, being asked to voice their opinion in front of the team. It's interesting when you were saying you're quite happy in a half-day meeting, Jo, because I think with my specialist and implementer, I find lots and lots of, like, a morning of communication, sitting in a room having a meeting, overwhelming, and I want to sort of get back and sort of be doing my own work. Whereas I think for you it would be much more within your comfort zone, because it's bigger picture often and it's leading towards getting something done. So I think it's worth bearing that in mind when you're looking at length as well, that it's, for some people, it's going to be quite useful to be able to set a time and to say, okay, this is the time that we're allocating, quite apart from having it, the rest of your workload. I think from a team role perspective, people are going to be approaching the meeting with quite different sort of expectations.
Aren't they just? There's a really good comment that's just been made actually by Douglas. Is there danger that if some people are not involved in earlier meetings, we said choose the people that you need for that particular objective, that it becomes inefficient because you've got to keep bringing them up to speed, don't you? You have to keep saying, right, at the last meeting we X, Y, and Z. Does that balance out? Does it? Oh. Again, I think communication is key here, isn't it? I think if you're having meetings and perhaps not everybody is involved, but more people are involved in the bigger picture, that to communicate the decisions that were made, to communicate progress that was done straight after the meeting, not just to the people in it, but to the wider team, is really important. Otherwise, people are going to feel that they have missed out. They're going to wonder what was discussed. And like you say, you're going to be too busy sort of reviewing the backstory each time you meet after that. So communication is really key there to make sure that those decisions, etc., are out to everybody.
Definitely. And I think you've got the, I don't think it was in the slide, but one of our slides where you're showing the coordinator and perhaps the shaper and team worker contributions going kind of along that scale. That I think with the coordinator, it's that bigger picture, isn't it? It's the overseeing, but also the handoff. You've got that ideas phase, then you've got the analysis. Arguably, you don't need to bring the monitor evaluator or the implementer up to speed on all the ideas you rejected. So if you're doing things in the right order, ideally, I know it doesn't necessarily always work that way, then you should be saving time by not sort of having everybody present. But as you say, you have to have that overview. You have to have that eye to when you're bringing people in and out. It's part of the design of the team as well as designing the meetings, isn't it?
Absolutely. Okay. So now we're looking at, so we've got the objective of the team, we know the behaviours that we need, we know the size, and we know the timings that are going to be involved. What we do want to make sure is, what is actually the desired outcome? What is it that we're trying to get from that meeting? Are we trying to get to a point where we have the objective of this meeting is to get lots of ideas on the table. The objective of this meeting is to look at those ideas and see which one is actually going to work. The objective of this meeting is to allocate work to people for future work that's being doing. So on and so forth. It's quite important that we have this clarity again up front, isn't it?
Definitely. And there was another question actually, which I think ties in here, about how to manage people who have flatter profiles. And I think we haven't maybe made obvious to people who aren't so familiar with team roles that we're talking, when we're because there are 9 team roles and we're talking about teams of between 4 and 6, that people are playing more than one role. But I think where you've got someone with flatter profiles, I think, what would you say, Jo? I guess there's more in terms of personal development and drawing out those contributions.
Yes, I mean, I suppose this could go into a longer webinar, but really when you have quite a flat profile, that sometimes if it's just based on their self-perception, how they see themselves, how they see their strengths in each of these 9, and they're not quite sure, it could be that you ask them as part of their development to start adding feedback from other people, because it's very often the observers that really do pick out those strengths that perhaps we don't see in ourselves. So it really is an idea, if you're not too sure what your contribution should be, is to ask others. If you've still got quite a flat profile because they don't know either, then yeah, it's a case of going, well, which one do you feel you could make most of the contribution in, and trying it. You know, putting your hand up saying, you know, this is the behaviour, this is the contribution I think I'm going to make for this meeting. And then over time, you'll be able to work out which ones are actually the most useful, and to get more observer feedback to check that it's coming from others. There's nothing worse, is there, than going to a meeting and thinking that actually they want all of this list done and you've got 45 minutes. So to make sure that you know exactly what the outcome needs to be is quite crucial. Okay, I'm just going to have a quick look at the chat here. Walter's asking, does the moment of the day influence the richness of the conversation, discussion, efficiency? Do you mean the time of the day, Walter? I would agree if that is the case with Daniel Pink, but it's more difficult, isn't it, now that we work in multinational teams and have all around the world meetings. I know that we have our distributor meetings when we have people from all around the world who represent Belbin globally. It can be really hard, especially when it's in the morning in the UK and somebody's drinking a gin and tonic in Singapore, for example. So I think the time of the day does influence the richness, but sometimes we can't dictate that due to the, just due to the global way that we work now. So that's a good statement. Adrian, rather than using the phrase playing a role, contributing a role, absolutely. It's however you want to say that, playing, contributing. We're not trying to act out our lives, but collaborate with others. Nicely put there. Thank you for that, Adrian. That's fantastic. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So you know roughly who you've got in your pool of people who you want to be involved in the meeting. So it's always a really good idea just to check the team roles, to check where the contributions are. And it allows you to do a little bit of prep beforehand to make sure that the dynamics are there, and to ensure things like who to put in the chair, for example. Sometimes it can be the coordinator who naturally takes the chair in meetings. Doesn't have to be. Also allows you to think about the question is the person who's got the highest coordinator who I want to chair, do they necessarily have the authority to do so? So again, there's that discussion to have with yourself before the meeting actually takes place. And these pages are taken from the Belbin Team Report, where it takes all of the individual data together and looks at them as a team, highlighting who is going to make those potential contributions for each of those team roles. It's a really useful one to have. We're just going to go on to the next slide here, because now we're actually in the meeting. So you're doing all the prep that you possibly can, all of the prep to ensure that your meetings are going to be as effective as possible. But then you have people actually in the meeting. What do you need to do? Well, you need to do a bit of prep here first, actually. I was in New Zealand about 10 years ago, and I had the good fortune of sitting there while people were telling me how they used Belbin, which was lovely. So I didn't have to talk, I could just listen. And one organisation said that they actually had the team circle, which is behind me, and we'll see in a bit more detail in a sec, in every single meeting room, because they started every single meeting by putting their top 2 team roles on the team circle and predicting which way that meeting was going to go. And by understanding the behaviours in the room and also which contribution they were trying to make at the time, because we have more than one strength, don't we? To know which hat you're putting on, knowing which contribution that you are needed to make, it actually helped them reduce the times in meetings by 50%. do you know, if I could spend 50% less time in meetings, that would be fantastic. So they used this, and I think this is also going into one question we were often asked is, I've done Belbin, what do I do now? What do I do now? And that again is the case of start using the language, and using the language of Belbin in meetings is a wonderful way to do that. Donna, don't worry, all of these slides are just taken. I've just snipped things out of the guide that you're going to be receiving. So don't worry. I know there's a lot of information on them, but everything's going to be in that guide, which you should get later on today. So I'm just going to stop sharing here. Phew, right. And I'm just going, that's what I'm going to do, isn't it? I've forgotten what I was doing. Now,
your high-tech solution.
so high-tech. I have this on a Miro board, I have it on a PowerPoint, but I just love an actual flip chart. So once people are in the meeting, one thing that would be great is to get them to put their top 2 team roles up. So we thought we'd do this as a demonstration to how meetings can sometimes happen in the Belbin office. I thought that was going to be interesting. I haven't asked anybody's permission, but I'm sure they're fine. Okay, so we're going to put Jill, anybody who knows Jill, knows she's a really high implementer and team worker. For anybody who knows Nicola, she's also a really high team worker, and she's also a high resource investigator. Vicky's already said she's a high specialist implementer. Lisa is a high resource investigator shaper. And if we were having a meeting, actually, what I would do is I'd play slightly different roles. I'd probably, because I can't not, play the resource investigator, but also the coordinator. So this is if us 5 were having a meeting, and perhaps it was to work out ideas for our next 5 blogs that we were going to do. Okay, so it's going to be working out the ideas of our next 5 blogs and how we were going to use them, you know, what articles we were going to use, etc. So more of a marketing discussion. How would this pan out? How would everybody be contributing?
You can tell us in the chat if you
Yeah,
want.
tell us in the chat. How do you think? Okay, so if this was a sort of more at the beginning of a project, we have a meeting because we wanted to discuss ideas for blog articles. We wanted to discuss, you know, perhaps what was going on outside world, how can we move them in to Belbin, and where perhaps we'd place those blog articles. Looking at the dynamics here, for those of you who know Belbin Team Roles, what are your observations? How would you predict that this meeting may go? I know we're not giving you a huge amount of information, but it would be interesting just to hear your thoughts, or read your thoughts even. It's quite telling, isn't it? It depends if Meredith's in the office.
Yeah, Emma says no new ideas. Yeah,
absolutely. So
yeah, Douglas says lots of ideas brought in from the resource investigators about what is done elsewhere. We do
need you, Emma. It's been said actually. Overcluttered in social roles, not quite enough in the thinking roles. Lack of innovative ideas. Okay. Anybody else would like to make any comments here? Because we're going to tell you what happens in real true life. Okay. Actually, looking at the time, we don't have. We'll crack on actually. What tends to happen in meetings? No big aha moments. No, yeah, the ME is not there, is it? To be honest with you, it's an interesting one because yes, when we're looking at new ideas for new blog posts, new articles, etc., ideas from that start with the conversation, oh, did you see that? Or how about this? Or whatever. Lots and lots of chatting, isn't there, in our meetings? But then after the initial chat, what happens is this starts taking over. So then it suddenly becomes really, really, really practical, really practical. Vicky, how engaged are you in those sorts of meetings?
It depends. I think if it was blog articles specifically, I think the functional considerations might take over there. But what I do see, I think, and I'm thinking about a slightly different context now, but I tend, yeah, the implementer takes over. I think Nicola in reality has got quite a bit of implementer as well. And we start getting into processes and how we're going to do things, and we don't spend enough time on why. And I think Joe, with that coordinator, starts to go a bit, a bit stir crazy because no one's picking their head up. So I think, yeah, we get, there's the excitement there. I think there's the, oh, we can do this, let's run with it. And we've kind of run off and started thinking about how we can make our spreadsheets, but we haven't necessarily done the bigger picture. Would you say that's fair?
I think that is fair, and I think we're also really conscious of this, aren't we? I think
Yes.
that's one thing we are as a team. So when we meet up, this isn't just a team, this is for a meeting of us, you know, all having a meeting together about something in particular. I think what we tend to do is try and say, right, what type of meeting is this? If it's right at the very beginning, Jill, wonderful implementer, wonderful team worker. We want her to perhaps have her team worker hat on because she listens a lot to people's wants and needs and everything else. And this is really important, but to ask her to take her implementer hat off a little bit, to allow those ideas to really come forward. What we do find, which is quite interesting, is Lisa, because she's got high shape and resource investigator, is that she needs a really short meeting, otherwise she's off anyway, isn't she? But to have these conversations, it looks different for all of you, and it's difficult to try and recreate a sort of a false environment in a way, but it's working out in this meeting right at the very start where are going to be the strengths, where are going to be the weaknesses, does it matter for the objective of what this meeting is here for, and to ensure that everybody knows which role that they are there to play. I can't stress that enough, actually, because very often I have to try and go like that, because actually there's too much resource investigator in the room and I have to just play my coordinator, especially when we come to quite critical meetings as well. But I really would recommend everybody using this, using the team circle, right at the very beginning of most meetings, to be able to predict that performance. It's really, really useful to do. And also I think there's a sense of bringing yourself into the meeting. You have more of an ownership, you have more of that understanding of the why, and that always builds on things like psychological safety and trust as well, doesn't it? So it's really, really crucial. Right, here we go, back to the slides. Okay, here we go. So absolutely, consider which contributions are missing, which ones are important, what is the purpose. Make sure you have that conversation when people are in the room. Also check those opposites. We don't have time to go on about that now to a great deal of detail, but look at those opposites that might be in those meetings. By opposites, for people who are not too sure, not so familiar about Belbin team roles, it's when you have behaviours which clash. So you have the high drive of the shaper who's bringing energy to make sure that you get to an outcome. And then the opposite of that would be the team worker, the one who cares, who's got a lot of empathy, who listens. And they can sometimes clash because they're coming from opposite sides of the circle, so to speak. So it's really important to be aware of those because that's where there could be potential conflict. So being aware of those both before the meeting and right at the very beginning, so crucial. In fact, Vicky and I work very much like that. We're poles apart with our team roles, but we understand that. We know where we may annoy each other a little, just a little, but we know that together it's a real powerful combination, and that's where you need to get for your meetings as well. Okay, hybrid. We're going to briefly touch on hybrid teams now. We've just got a few minutes left of the webinar because we found that there were. That was interesting, was it? There was a lot of meetings people thought were far more efficient and effective when people were working virtually. Our survey showed that, but it really did depend on the team roles of the people, didn't it? And let me just stop sharing my screen there, and I'm going to very quickly see if I can share. Okay, that's the wrong page, but here we go. This meetings. We can send you a copy of our research that we did about virtual teamwork. But what we found is that for people who were working just remotely, they found that their meetings were more frequent and actually more effective. But the ones that actually viewed the meeting situation quite negatively were the plants resource investigators and shapers. And we had a discussion of why that may be, didn't we, Vicky?
Yeah, absolutely. I think especially at the time that we did this, I think people were very much in implementer mode. This was sort of early on in lockdown. So I think there was a real implementer emphasis on keeping businesses going and making things, sort of being productive and efficient. And actually, I think what was missing was people weren't necessarily space of innovation. So I think we were seeing a lot more frustration, as you say, from plants and resource investigators. And I think it may be fair to say, although this is moving away from the research, but just what we were discussing, weren't we, that there's a certain amount of energy, I think, that you get in the room, which might be more appealing to those sort of roles. I think for a shaper, I can imagine it might be quite difficult to, or more difficult perhaps, to recreate that talking to a screen than it is when you've got people there. So again, it's just being aware, isn't it, of how those different team roles are responding and what people are sort of judging as an effective meeting, because having something that's efficient is very different to having something where you've come up with maybe hundreds of ideas. So yeah.
And again, that's going back to the beginning, isn't it? Yeah. What's crucial in all of this is the pre-work for meetings. It's making sure that not just you that who knows the objective and the purpose, but that is successfully communicated and clearly communicated with everybody else as well. It's about managing expectations, understanding what it is that everybody needs to get to. Okay, I'm just going to share my screen for just I think one more slide.
We've had so much to say, haven't we? We've kind of raced to the end.
So that's making 45 minutes. We need those extra 15. We also have information within the guide that we'll be sending you all about how to change those decision-making processes when they come to meetings as well. We won't go into this now. It is all part of the guide that we will send to you. But very interesting to look at. So meetings often have great potential, and that can sometimes be wasted. Making sure that you understand exactly what the meeting's for, understanding the behaviours that are required, understanding the people who can bring those behaviours to the team, making sure you keep those numbers small, make sure that everything's communicated with absolute clarity, making sure that you remember if people are working from home or in a hybrid situation, that also other factors come into play. All of this can really help your meetings become more effective, and hopefully all of you will be able to answer the fact that you've never been in a meeting with wasted time. I'll stop sharing my screen there because we've come to the end of our allotted time. We've whizzed through so much. You will be getting a recording, a copy of the how-to guide, and also I think I'll put a link in to that study, that virtual study, Vicky, which I think will be really useful for people as well. If you do have time and you have questions, please stay with us. We're going to be here for another few minutes, but otherwise, thank you so much for joining us. Remember that the language of Belbin, it's not just about a workshop, it's not just about a one-off. It can be used again and again and again throughout your working day, throughout your working life, to really, really make that impact. So thank you for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.